The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Margaret Hollis had burned every bridge she'd ever stood on. She didn't read it twice. She didn't need to. The words were plain enough: the arrangement has been reconsidered, which was the kind of language men used when they meant you are no longer useful to us. The man who wrote it, a cattle broker named Denton Falk, had spent 3 weeks telling Evelyn Mercer that the offer was solid, the family was decent, and the rancher was a good man who simply needed help. What Denton had not mentioned, what nobody had mentioned, was that Nathaniel Voss had already turned away 2 women before her, that the last one left crying on the station platform, that the children had reportedly thrown rocks at the wagon of the one before that. Evelyn folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She had 43 cents, 1 suitcase, and a ticket that was already paid for. She boarded the train anyway. If you've ever felt like you were walking into a room where nobody wanted you there, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The train from Abilene to the junction at Harlan Creek took 6 hours on a good day. This was not a good day. The car Evelyn rode in smelled of coal smoke and livestock and something else she couldn't quite name. Old sweat, maybe, or the particular desperation of people traveling toward things they weren't sure about. She sat with her suitcase wedged between her knees and her hands folded in her lap, watching the Texas brush flatten out around her until there was nothing but sky and dust and the occasional dark shape of a water tank standing alone against the horizon, like a man who'd been left there and forgotten. She was 31 years old. That was the part nobody put in the advertisements. The mail-order catalogs always ran descriptions that made women sound like furniture: hardworking, pleasant disposition, experienced in household management. But they never mentioned age unless it was a selling point, and 31 was not a selling point in 1884. 31 meant you'd already missed the window that most people agreed upon. It meant there was probably a reason. It meant the question hanging over every conversation wasn't, "What are you looking for?" but "What went wrong?" Nothing had gone wrong. That was the honest answer, and she'd stopped bothering to give it. Her mother had died when Evelyn was 24, and she'd spent the years after that keeping her father's household running because someone had to and he wasn't going to. Then her father died too. A slow, miserable death from a lung condition that took 2 years to finish the job. And she'd spent those 2 years nursing him and watching what little money they had drain out like water through cracked clay. By the time he was gone, there was nothing left. No property, no savings. A handful of furniture that fetched almost nothing at auction. She had a cousin in Missouri who'd offered her a room in exchange for help with the children, but Evelyn had spent enough of her life being useful to people who didn't actually see her. She wanted something different. She wasn't entirely sure she could name what that was, but she recognized the feeling of wanting it. So she answered an advertisement. Nathaniel Voss, widower, 3 children, ranch outside the town of Calder's Bend, Texas. Seeking a capable woman of steady character who is not afraid of hard work. That was all it said. No romantic language, no promises of affection. She'd appreciated that, actually. It felt honest in a way that made her trust it more than the ones that talked about companionship and warmth and building a life together. What it did not say was that Nathaniel Voss had not wanted to place the advertisement in the first place. She didn't know that yet. She'd find out soon enough. The train pulled into Harlan Creek at 4:30 in the afternoon, and Evelyn stepped off onto a platform that was basically just 2 planks of weathered wood and a post with a sign that someone had nailed up crooked. 3 other passengers got off with her. They collected their things and walked away without looking back, which was the particular skill of people who knew where they were going. Evelyn stood there. There was supposed to be someone waiting. That was what Denton Falk's letter had said. A man will meet you at the station. She looked left and right along the platform. A dog was sleeping under the far end of the bench. A boy of about 14 was sitting on a fence post eating something from a cloth. Otherwise, the place was empty. She waited 20 minutes. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked to the only building with lights on, which turned out to be a general store that also functioned as the post office and, on weekends, apparently a barbershop. The woman behind the counter was broad-shouldered and iron-haired and looked at Evelyn the way people look at weather they're not sure about yet. "I'm looking for the Voss Ranch," Evelyn said. "I was told someone would meet me." The woman's expression did something complicated. "You're the new one," she said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn Mercer. The woman, her name turned out to be Ada Pruitt, who ran the store with her husband and knew everything about everyone within 30 miles, folded her arms across her chest and looked Evelyn over with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for livestock. "You know he sent the last one home before she even made it to the property." "I heard something like that." "She cried the whole way back, they say." Ada paused. "The one before her didn't cry. She just looked relieved." Evelyn set her suitcase down. Her arm was tired. "Is there someone who can take me out to the ranch, or should I walk?" Ada's mouth twitched. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "Cecil can take you. He's out back." She disappeared through a curtained doorway, and Evelyn heard voices, and then a man emerged, younger than she expected, with the sun-beaten face of someone who spent most of his life outdoors and a wagon that had seen considerable better days. Cecil Pruitt didn't say much. He loaded her suitcase without being asked, climbed onto the seat, and clicked his tongue at the horses. Evelyn climbed up beside him. They rode in silence for a while. The sun was getting lower and the light was going that particular color. It goes before it gives up entirely. Orange and pink, and something deeper underneath, the kind of color that looks beautiful and feels like a warning. The road to the Voss Ranch was not a road so much as a set of wheel ruts in the ground, and the wagon lurched through them in a rhythm that would have been meditative if Evelyn hadn't been gripping the seat rail to keep from sliding off. "He's not a bad man," Cecil said finally. Evelyn looked at him. "Nathaniel, people talk like he's some kind of—" Cecil shrugged one shoulder. "He's not. He just doesn't know what to do with himself anymore. Since Margaret died." He said the name carefully, the way people say the names of the dead when they're not sure the living are ready to hear them. "That was 2 years ago. Fever took her in April. 3 days, start to finish." "I'm sorry to hear that." "The kids took it hard. The oldest, Lillian. She basically became the mother overnight. 11 years old and she's running a household." Cecil shook his head. "It's not right." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It's not. Samuel won't talk to anybody. He's 9. Used to be the loudest kid in the county, they say. Now you can go a whole day without hearing his voice." He paused. "And the little one, Rosie, she's 6. She still looks for her mama sometimes, like she just forgot and then remembers again." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the darkening land around them, at the way the grass moved in the evening wind, at the shape of a building appearing in the distance. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Cecil was quiet for a moment. "Because I want you to understand what you're walking into. The other women, they came expecting something. A household that was struggling but basically functional. A man who was sad but managing." He looked at her sideways. "What you're getting is something different." "What am I getting?" "A wreck," he said. "Not unkindly. A good wreck, if that makes sense. Good people who've come apart." She thought about that. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the ranch house, and Evelyn climbed down and looked at it. It was not what she'd imagined, though she'd tried not to imagine too much. The house was solid enough, 2 stories, good timber, built by someone who knew what they were doing. But the yard was in a state. Fence rails missing, a gate hanging at an angle. The garden plot beside the house was a tangle of dead growth that nobody had cleared since the previous fall, or maybe the fall before that. The front door opened. A girl stood in the doorway. 11 years old, brown hair pulled back in a way that looked like she'd done it herself, and done it in a hurry. She was wearing an apron that was too big for her, and she was holding a wooden spoon and looking at Evelyn with the expression of someone who has been disappointed enough times to have stopped expecting anything different. "You're the new one," the girl said. The same words Ada Pruitt had used, the same tone. "I'm Evelyn Mercer." Lillian Voss. She said it the way adults said their names. No softness. "My father's inside. He's not in a good mood. I'm sorry. He wasn't in a good mood when he sent for you either, so—" She stopped herself. Something shifted in her face, something that might have been embarrassment. "I'm just telling you so you know." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. Lillian studied her for another second. Then she stepped back and held the door open. The inside of the house was better and worse than outside, depending on where you looked. Someone had recently swept the floor. Lillian, Evelyn guessed. The table was cleared. But there was a quality to the space that Evelyn recognized, a kind of hollowness that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with the people in it. It was the feeling of a house where nobody was quite living anymore, where everyone was just existing and waiting for something to change and not quite believing it would. Nathaniel Voss was standing at the far end of the main room, his back to her, looking at something on the shelf. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, weathered in the way of men who worked land for a living. He turned around slowly, like a man who'd been rehearsing the moment and had decided to stop rehearsing because it wasn't helping. He looked at her. She looked at him. I was not what she'd expected either. She'd expected someone who looked beaten down, and he did, partly. There were lines around his eyes that went deeper than weather, and something in his jaw that stayed tight even when the rest of his face was neutral. But he also looked like someone who had been fighting hard to hold himself together for a long time, and was starting to lose track of whether it was working. Miss Mercer, he said. Mr. Voss. He didn't offer his hand. She didn't extend hers. They stood there for a moment with about 12 feet of worn floorboard between them, and Evelyn thought, this is the part where it goes one way or the other. The arrangement, he said, and then stopped. She waited. I want you to understand that I placed that advertisement because my daughter asked me to. He said it flatly, like he was reading from a ledger. Not because it was my idea. Lillian said the children needed someone consistent, and she's right, and He exhaled. I'm not trying to be unkind, I just want to be clear about what this is. What is it? Evelyn asked. He looked at her like the question caught him slightly off guard. A practical arrangement. You'd help manage the house, help with the children. In return, you have a place to live, and the marriage? Another pause. His jaw tightened. A legal matter, for the sake of propriety. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, exactly, but because there was something almost admirable in how completely wrong he was about how this was going to go. She didn't say that. She just said, all right. He seemed to have expected an argument. The absence of one threw him slightly. All right, he repeated. I'd like to see where I'll be sleeping, she said, and then I'd like to see the kitchen. He showed her to a room at the back of the house that was clean but barely furnished. A bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over the back field. She set her suitcase on the floor and opened it, and took out the one good dress she'd packed, which she hung on the peg on the wall, and then she went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was a disaster, not dirty, Lillian had clearly been trying, but disorganized in the way of a space that no one with real authority had tended to in a long time. The stores were nearly bare. The pantry held a sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, salt, a little coffee, and 3 jars of something that had been put up in better days. The bread tin was empty. The pot hanging over the cold stove had residue in it from what looked like a previous day's meal that nobody had gotten around to cleaning out. Lillian appeared in the kitchen doorway. I do what I can, she said, defensive before anyone had said anything. I can see that, Evelyn said. You've been doing the work of 3 people. The girl stiffened slightly, like she'd been ready for criticism, and the lack of it confused her. I'm 11. I know. I don't know how to make bread properly. I've tried. It comes out wrong. I'll show you. Evelyn looked around the kitchen again. Tomorrow. Tonight, let's see what we can make with what's here. What they made was a pot of beans with salt pork and cornbread that was not exactly beautiful but was warm and filling, and they ate it at the table, Evelyn, Lillian, and a small girl with enormous eyes who had appeared at some point without Evelyn noticing and had attached herself to the end of the bench as far from everyone as possible. Rosie. She had her mother's coloring, Evelyn guessed, though she had no way of knowing for certain. She had the look of a child who had recently learned that the world was not entirely safe and was still deciding what to do with that information. She ate her beans and didn't say anything. Samuel did not come to dinner. Evelyn asked Lillian about it quietly, and Lillian's expression went careful. He eats in his room sometimes, when there's someone new. She paused. Or when there's not. Nathaniel came to the table late, after the children were already eating. He sat down at the head of it and served himself without comment. Halfway through the meal, he looked up and said to Lillian, Beans are better tonight. Miss Mercer made them, Lillian said. He looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. He returned to his beans. That was the first dinner, after the children were in bed. She put Rosie down herself, because Lillian looked exhausted, and Nathaniel had disappeared back outside, and someone had to. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the cold lamp and made a list. Not of feelings, of things. What the pantry needed, what the yard needed, what the garden needed, what the fence post she'd counted on the way in needed. She wrote it all down in the small book she'd brought with her, the one she'd been using for accounts and lists for the last 5 years, and when she was done, she looked at the length of the list and felt something she hadn't expected. Not dread. Something more like focus. She was good at this. At looking at something broken and figuring out what order to put it back together in. She'd done it with her father's household for 7 years. She'd done it with the books at the mill in Abilene where she'd worked for 8 months before the owner's wife decided she didn't want a woman around who was better with numbers than her husband was. She had never been particularly good at making people like her, but she was very good at understanding what a situation actually needed and going about providing it. The Voss Ranch needed a great deal. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. In the morning, she was up before anyone else. She lit the stove and put coffee on and went out to look at the chicken coop in the early light, which turned out to be in better shape than she'd feared. The hens were thin and unhappy but alive, and there were eggs, more than she expected. She gathered them in her apron and went back inside and was scrambling eggs when Lillian appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, already wearing her hair pulled back, already wearing the expression of someone expecting to be given work. Evelyn looked at her. "What's your favorite thing to eat for breakfast?" she asked. Lillian stared. What? Favorite thing, for breakfast. When it was good. The girl thought about it for a moment, and something shifted in her face. Something young and unguarded that she normally kept covered. "Mama used to make Johnny cakes," she said, "with honey." "We don't have honey right now," Evelyn said, "but we have cornmeal. Go wake your brother." Lillian went. She came back a few minutes later without Samuel. "He won't come." "Okay," Evelyn said. She made the Johnny cakes anyway and left 2 of them covered on a plate by the stairs. When she went to the barn an hour later to see about the condition of the animals, the plate was empty. She didn't say anything about it to anyone. The day went the way first days go when you're somewhere entirely new and don't know the rhythms of the place yet. In fits and starts, with pockets of work you could sink into and then sudden walls where you didn't know what came next. She cleared the garden plot. Or she started to. It was a bigger job than one morning, and by midday her back ached and her hands had blisters from the unfamiliar tool, and she sat down in the dirt for a few minutes. Not because she was giving up, but because she needed to decide what order to do the next part in. Nathaniel found her there. I was coming back from somewhere, the far field maybe, or checking the water, and he stopped about 10 feet away and looked at her sitting in the dirt of the cleared garden with blisters on her hands and soil on her dress and the expression of a person doing mental arithmetic. "You're working the garden," he said, "trying to." "I haven't had anyone in that garden since—" He stopped. "Since your wife," she said. He didn't answer. "I'm not trying to replace anything," she said. She looked up at him from where she was sitting. "I'm trying to make the ground useful again. That's not the same thing." He stood there for a moment, and she could see him working out what to do with that, whether to be angry about it or whether to let it be what it was. He said, "The east corner gets more water. Better to plant the squash there." Then he walked away. She looked at the east corner of the garden. She moved the squash. That afternoon, Rosie appeared beside her while she was working on the fence post closest to the house. One of the ones she'd identified as needing repair. The simplest one to start with, where the rail had just slipped from its notch. Rosie didn't say anything. She just stood there watching with her enormous eyes. "You want to help?" Evelyn asked. Rosie looked at the fence post, then at Evelyn, then at the fence post again. "I don't know how," she said. She spoke very quietly, like she'd gotten out of the habit. "Neither did I, the first time," Evelyn said. "Here." She showed her where to hold the rail while she set it. Rosie held it. Her small hands were serious about the job. She didn't let go until Evelyn told her to. Good, Evelyn said. Rosie looked at her hands. Then she reached out and touched the sleeve of Evelyn's dress with 2 fingers, carefully, like she was checking if it was real, and walked back toward the house. Evelyn watched her go. She'd been through hard things before. She'd learned that hard things didn't usually announce themselves dramatically. They just showed up and kept being hard until something shifted, and you couldn't always tell when the shift was coming or what was going to cause it. You just had to keep going and trust that the work was doing something even when you couldn't see it. She set the next fence post. Dinner that night was better than the night before because she'd managed to get to the store by way of Cecil Pruitt's wagon. He was going anyway, he said, and had come back with enough to work with. Nathaniel had not offered money for the supplies, and she had not asked him for it. She'd used the last of her own, which left her with 11 cents. But she'd been poorer before, and they had to eat tonight regardless. She made a proper meal. Biscuits from scratch, salt pork gravy, boiled potatoes, the eggs from the morning. Lillian sat across from Rosie and ate with the focused attention of someone who had forgotten that food could taste like anything. Rosie ate without her eyes leaving her plate except for the one moment when she looked up and across the table at Evelyn and then looked quickly back down. Samuel appeared. He came in without warning, in the way of children who have decided something but haven't decided to announce it yet. He was thin, thinner than he should have been, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, Evelyn guessed, and he sat down at the far end of the table and served himself without looking at anyone. Evelyn didn't make any of the gestures people usually made when a withdrawn child finally showed up. She didn't exclaim. She didn't say she was glad he'd come. She just passed him the biscuits when they got close to his side of the table and said, "They're better with the gravy." He took one. He put gravy on it. He ate it. Nathaniel came in late again. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Samuel at the table, and something happened in his face, a quick, controlled thing that he shut down almost immediately. And then he sat down and served himself and didn't say anything. The meal was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the night before. The first night had been the silence of people who didn't know what to do with each other. This one was something slightly different. Not comfortable, not yet. It was too early for that, and she knew better than to expect it. But it was the silence of people sitting at the same table and eating the same food and not actively retreating. It was something. After dinner, she washed the dishes, and Lillian dried them, and at some point Lillian said, without looking up from the pot she was working on, "The last woman who came, the one before you, she said the house was too sad." Evelyn dried her hands on the towel. "What do you think?" Lillian was quiet for a moment. "I think it's not that it's sad," she said carefully. "It's that nobody's been trying to change it." Evelyn looked at her, 11 years old. "I think you're right," she said. Lillian nodded once and hung up the pot. She did not say anything else. But when Evelyn passed her on the way out of the kitchen, the girl's shoulder was a little less rigid than it had been when the evening started. Evelyn went to sit on the front step for a few minutes, because she needed to think, and she thought better with air. The night was the kind of dark that Texas nights get when you're far enough from any town. Total and enormous, the kind that makes you aware of your own smallness, and then, strangely, your own significance. She could hear the horses in the barn, the wind in the grass. From somewhere upstairs, the faint sound of a child's steady breathing through an open window. She sat there for a while. She had 43 cents when she got on the train. She had 11 cents now, which was technically worse, and she was sitting on the porch of a man who had made it reasonably clear she was here out of necessity rather than welcome, in a town where the woman at the general store had already told her 2 previous women had failed this particular assignment. The thing she knew, the thing she'd learned in 7 years of managing a household that didn't want managing and 8 months in a job she was better at than anyone wanted her to be, was that belonging wasn't something you got given. You had to build it, piece by piece, with the same patience you'd use on a fence post or a garden or a child who had forgotten he was allowed to eat with other people. You had to decide it was worth doing before anyone told you it was. The front door opened behind her. She expected Lillian, or maybe Rosie, following her silently, as she'd already started doing. It was Nathaniel. He came and stood at the edge of the porch, not quite next to her, but not all the way away from her either, looking out at the same dark yard she'd been looking at. "Samuel came to dinner," he said. "Yes." "He hasn't done that in—" He stopped. "A while. I noticed." Another long silence. She didn't fill it. She'd learned that some silences needed to be filled and others needed to be left alone to see what grew in them. "My wife used to sit out here in the evenings," Nathaniel said. He didn't say it like a warning, more like he was testing what it felt like to say it out loud to someone new. "What did she think about?" Evelyn asked. He glanced at her sideways. "I never asked." He was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking about? She considered the question honestly. The east corner of the garden, she said, and whether the cornmeal will stretch to the end of the week. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, she didn't think he'd gotten back there yet, but something in the neighborhood. Probably not, he said. No, she agreed. I'll need to figure that out. He stood there for another minute. Then he went back inside. She stayed on the step a while longer. It was the end of the first day, and she was still here. The children had eaten. Samuel had come to the table. Rosie had touched her sleeve. Lillian had said something honest to her in a kitchen at the end of a long day. It was not a lot. It was enough. The second week started the way most second weeks do, with the small, grinding reality of the first week wearing off and the actual size of the problem becoming clearer. Evelyn had spent the first 7 days learning the shape of things. Now she understood it well enough to know that what she was dealing with was not simply a neglected household. It was a household that had stopped believing in itself. The pantry was a symptom. The broken fence posts were a symptom. Even the way Nathaniel moved through his own house, careful, contained, touching nothing he didn't have to, was a symptom of something deeper than grief. It was what happened to a person after grief had been running the show long enough to start feeling normal. She got up before dawn on Monday and went to the barn. The horses were in reasonable shape. Nathaniel had kept up with them, which told her something about what he valued and what he'd let go. The 2 milk cows were another matter. Their production had dropped off badly. She could tell from the way the older one stood, and from the condition of the bedding that hadn't been properly changed in too long. She spent an hour in there before breakfast, doing what needed doing, and when she came back inside with mud on her boots and straw in her hair, she found Lillian already in the kitchen trying to make porridge from the last of the cornmeal. "I burned it," Lillian said without turning around. Her voice had that particular flatness that comes from expecting to be criticized. Evelyn came and looked at the pot. "Scrape the top layer off, the bottom's fine." Lillian looked at her. "You can do that?" "Burns on the outside, not all the way through. You scrape it and keep going." She took the spoon and showed her, clearing the blackened layer from the top of the porridge until the good stuff underneath was visible. "See?" Lillian took the spoon back and finished the job herself. She didn't say thank you, but she also didn't burn the next batch. That was how most of their kitchen lessons went. Quietly, without ceremony, with Evelyn showing something once and Lillian receiving it without making a production of receiving it. The girl had pride the way certain plants have thorns. Not to be mean, just to survive. Evelyn understood that. She didn't try to work around it. She just showed up and did the thing and let Lillian decide what to make of it. The garden was beginning to show the first signs of actual progress. She'd cleared the dead growth and turned the soil in the east corner, where Nathaniel had told her the water ran better, and she'd put in squash seeds from a paper packet she'd found at the back of the pantry shelf. Whether they were still viable was a question only time would answer, but you had to plant something. You couldn't just look at empty dirt and hope it would fix itself. She'd also found a serious problem with the chicken coop's east wall. Not visible from the outside, but when you put your hand against the lower boards, you could feel the give of wood that had started to rot from moisture getting in underneath. If it went unchecked through the spring rains, they'd lose the whole side of the structure, possibly the roof. She mentioned it to Nathaniel at dinner on the 4th day. He looked at her across the table. "I know about it." "Okay. I've been meaning to get to it." She didn't say anything to that. He put down his fork. "I've had other priorities." "I understand." She meant it. She wasn't saying it to placate him. He studied her for a moment like he was trying to decide if she was being honest or strategic. "You know how to repair a wall?" "I know how to figure it out," she said. He was quiet. "I'll look at it Saturday." Saturday came and he didn't look at it because there was a problem with the water pump that ate most of the morning and then a fence line on the north pasture that had come down overnight and let 2 of the cattle through, which ate the rest of the day. Evelyn watched him come in at dusk, looking like a man who had been fighting the same fire in different locations for about 3 years straight, and she didn't say anything about the chicken coop. She made a note in her small book and moved the chicken coop to the following week. It was during the second week that she began to understand Samuel. He was coming to dinner now, not every night, but most nights. And he still didn't talk much, but he'd started doing this thing where he'd position himself somewhere in whatever room she was working in without any stated reason for being there. She'd be sorting through the pantry and look up and he'd be in the doorway, leaning against the frame, looking at nothing in particular. She'd be on the porch mending a piece of harness, and he'd be sitting on the step below her, picking at a loose board. He never asked to help. He never explained himself. She let him be there. On the Wednesday of the second week, she was trying to figure out what was wrong with the bread. She'd made 2 loaves that had come out flat and dense, which told her something was off with either the starter or the temperature, or possibly both. And she was muttering to herself about it when Samuel, who was sitting at the far end of the kitchen table doing nothing visible, said, "It's too cold in here in the morning." She looked up. He was looking at the loaves with the expression of someone who had just said something without quite meaning to. "The bread rises better when it's warmer," he said, more carefully this time. "My mother used to put it near the stove. Not on the stove. Near it." "Near it," Evelyn repeated. "On the shelf above." "She moved the pickle jars." He paused. "I don't know if the pickle jars are still there." They were still there. She moved them without comment and put the next batch of dough on the shelf to rise, and the bread that came out of the oven that afternoon was the best she'd made since arriving. She put a slice in front of Samuel at dinner with butter on it without saying anything about whose idea it had been, and he ate it without saying anything either. But he came to the kitchen the next morning, not to help exactly. He just stood near the door and watched her work. And the morning after that, he handed her the salt before she asked for it, and the morning after that, he was stirring the porridge when she came in from the barn. She didn't make a speech about it. She just said, 2 minutes more, and he stirred for 2 more minutes, and the porridge didn't burn. It was Rosie who surprised her most. The little girl had started following her at a distance that gradually decreased as the days went on, the way a stray animal approaches, sidelong, with constant recalculation of risk. By the end of the second week, she was close enough that Evelyn could feel her beside her when they walked from the house to the garden. She still didn't say much, but she'd started asking questions in a very quiet voice, the kind you had to lean toward to hear properly. "What's that plant?" "Volunteer tomato. Grew on its own from a seed that fell last year." "Is it good?" "If it fruits, we'll see." "Can I water it?" "Sure. Don't drown it." Rosie watered it with the careful concentration of a surgeon. She checked on it every morning after that. Evelyn watched her from the corner of her eye and didn't comment because commenting would have made it a big thing, and it needed to stay a small thing for now. The problem with Nathaniel was more complicated. He was not unkind. She wanted to be fair about that. He was not a man who lashed out or created cruelty around himself the way some men did. But there was a distance he maintained that was deliberate and careful. A gap he kept between himself and everything that was working better than it had before, as though getting too close to any sign of improvement might cost him something he wasn't ready to lose again. She saw it in the way he'd look at the cleared garden and then look away. In the way he came to dinner later than necessary when the food smelled good, like he needed time to decide how much he was allowed to enjoy it. In the way he answered her questions about the ranch, directly, informatively, but never asked her any questions back. She was not bothered by this exactly. She was aware of it. There was a difference. On a Thursday afternoon in the middle of the third week, she was patching a section of the garden fence, cedar posts, wire. Not complicated, once you figured out the system. And Nathaniel came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw what she was doing. "I was going to get to that," he said. "I know." He watched her stretch the wire and secure it. She knew what she was doing. She'd watched her father do the same job on a smaller plot for years. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "My father's place. He ran cattle, chickens mostly, and a kitchen garden." She pulled the wire taut and held it with one hand while she worked the fastener with the other. "He wasn't well the last few years. Things needed doing." Nathaniel was quiet. "My father ran a spread about 40 miles east of here. I grew up on it." She glanced at him. "Was it like this?" "Bigger. Better water." He paused. "He died when I was 23. Left it to my older brother." "Not to you?" "I was the younger son." He said it without particular bitterness. "It's how it works." "Is that why you came out here? To build something of your own?" He looked at the fence she was fixing, at the garden behind it, at the space that was gradually becoming something again instead of nothing. "That was the plan," he said, and there was a heaviness in those 4 words that had nothing to do with the land. She secured the last fastener and tested the fence with her hand. It held. The plan still works, she said. He looked at her. The land's still here, she said. So are the children. She picked up her tools. So are you. She walked past him toward the house, and she didn't look back to see what he did with that. Some things you had to leave alone and let a person stand with for a while before they knew how they felt about them. The first real crisis came on a Sunday. It wasn't dramatic in the way that crises in stories usually are. It didn't announce itself. It began with Rosie at breakfast, who was quieter than usual and didn't finish her food, which was notable because Rosie had developed the appetite of someone making up for a long period of not quite having enough. Evelyn noticed and said nothing. She felt Rosie's forehead when she walked past her on the way to clear the plates, casual enough that the child wouldn't be alarmed. And it was warm. Not raging, but warm. By mid-morning, it was a fever. Not the ordinary kind that comes with a cold and breaks in a day or two. This one climbed steadily through the afternoon, and by evening Rosie was flushed and disoriented in the way of small children who run high fevers, saying things that didn't quite connect, and then going quiet in a way that was somehow worse than the nonsense. Lillian stood in the doorway of Rosie's room, looking at her sister with her arms wrapped around herself. She was trying to look calm and not entirely succeeding. "This is how it started with Mama," she said quietly. Evelyn looked at her. "This is a fever. Your mother had something else." "How do you know?" She didn't, fully, but she knew that the worst thing she could do right now was let the worst possibility fill the room. "Because fevers in children come up fast and break fast," she said. "We need to bring it down. Get me the wash basin. Cold water." Lillian moved. Having something specific to do helped. Evelyn had noticed that about her. Give her a task with edges and she could hold herself together around it. Nathaniel appeared in the hallway. He'd been outside when it started. Lillian had gone to get him at some point. He came to the doorway of Rosie's room and saw his youngest daughter lying in bed with her face the color of a sunset, and his hands dropped to his sides in a way that seemed almost involuntary. "How bad?" he said. "Working on it," Evelyn said. "Evelyn." She looked at him. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before. It was open in a way it hadn't been, the careful distance gone completely, and underneath it was something that looked very much like a man who was about to fall apart. "She's going to be okay," Evelyn said. Not because she knew for certain, because he needed a direction to lean toward, and she was the only thing solid enough to provide it. "I need the cold water. Go help Lillian." He went. They worked through the night, not dramatically. The drama of sick children is mostly just relentless repetition, wet cloths and quiet voices, and the constant monitoring of whether the number is going up or coming down. Samuel sat on the floor in the hallway outside Rosie's room because nobody had told him to go to bed, and he didn't want to. Lillian spelled Evelyn at the bedside every couple of hours, so Evelyn could rest her eyes for a few minutes on the chair in the corner. Nathaniel paced. He couldn't be still. He came in and out of the room all night, checking on Rosie, checking on the situation, checking on Evelyn in a way that he probably didn't realize he was doing. Around 3 in the morning, the fever broke. It happened the way fever breaks when it's ready, suddenly and completely, Rosie soaking through her nightgown and her breathing going slow and even, and her color coming back to something like normal. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and changed the child into dry clothes and smoothed her hair back and felt the particular kind of exhaustion that comes only after you've been afraid and the thing you were afraid of didn't happen. Rosie opened her eyes. They were clear. "I'm cold," she said. "I know." Evelyn tucked the blanket up around her shoulders. "You're going to be fine." Rosie looked at her for a long moment with those enormous eyes. Then she said very quietly, "You stayed." "I stayed," Evelyn said. Rosie closed her eyes and was asleep in about 30 seconds. Evelyn sat there a little longer. When she finally stood and turned around, Nathaniel was in the doorway. He'd been there for a while, she thought, long enough to have heard. He didn't say anything. She walked past him into the hallway, and they stood there together in the dark for a moment. And she was aware of how close they were to each other in the narrow space, both of them exhausted and relieved and not quite sure what to do with the feeling. "Thank you," he said. "You don't need to thank me." "I know I don't need to." He said it with a quiet firmness that surprised her slightly. "I'm doing it anyway." She nodded. She was too tired to manage much more than that. She went to bed as the sky was starting to go gray. Rosie recovered over the next 3 days, which she spent mostly in bed eating whatever Evelyn brought her with the single-minded focus of the newly well. Samuel visited her room every morning before breakfast and sat on the floor next to her bed and talked to her. Actually talked, in full sentences, about nothing in particular, the way siblings do when they've remembered they like each other. And Evelyn overheard pieces of it from the hallway without meaning to and didn't interrupt. It was during Rosie's recovery that Lillian came to find Evelyn in the garden with something she'd clearly been working up to for a while. She stood at the edge of the garden with her arms at her sides, not crossed, which was her usual defensive posture, but just hanging there, which Evelyn had come to recognize as Lillian deciding to be unguarded about something. "I'm sorry about what I said," Lillian said, "when you first got here." Evelyn sat back from where she was working and looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said, I implied, that you were going to leave." She was looking at the ground, like the others. "I don't remember feeling insulted." Lillian looked up. "You didn't? You were warning me about your father. You were warning me what I was walking into." Evelyn pulled a weed and set it aside. "That's not an insult. That's a kid looking out for her family." Something in Lillian's face crumbled a little and then rebuilt itself. "I do that a lot," she said. "I know. Is that a bad thing?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "It's a hard way to be 11, she said. "But it's also what's been keeping this family going." She looked at the girl. "You should be able to stop worrying so much. That's what I'm here for." Lillian stood there for a moment. Then she sat down in the dirt across from Evelyn, something she'd never done before, and picked up the small weeding tool from where it was lying unused and started working the section beside her. They didn't talk. They just worked. It was the best conversation they'd had. The issue with the chicken coop came to a head the following week because the spring rains came early, hard, driving rains that came in from the southwest, and didn't let up for 2 days. Evelyn was in the coop when the east wall started to give. She heard it before she saw it. A soft, tearing sound, the sound of wood that had been holding on by diminishing margins finally losing the argument. She got the hens out first, pushing them through the interior door into the main structure, ignoring the chaos of alarmed chickens because startled chickens were a problem. Injured chickens in a collapsed wall were a worse one. And then she braced the wall with her back and her shoulder and yelled for Nathaniel. He came running from the barn. He saw what was happening and didn't waste time with questions. He found the salvageable board from the scrap pile they'd been accumulating and got it into position on the outside while she held the wall from inside, and they worked together in the rain to brace the structure well enough to get through the night. It was not a repair, it was a holding action. But the wall held. Afterward, they stood in the rain because neither of them had thought to bring a hat, and Evelyn's dress was soaked through and her hair was plastered to her face, and Nathaniel had mud on his boots up to the shin. They looked at the braced wall. "I should have fixed this a month ago," he said. "Yes." He looked at her sideways. He'd expected her to say it's fine or don't worry about it. She could tell by the slight shift in his expression when she didn't. "I'll do it right this week," he said. "Not a patch job." "Good." She pushed her hair back from her face. "I'll help with the framing if you show me what you need." "You'll be sawing boards in the rain. It's not raining that hard." It was absolutely raining that hard. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, the closest she'd heard from him, and walked back toward the barn. She went inside and changed into dry clothes and stood in the kitchen for a minute, feeling the specific kind of aliveness that comes from having done something difficult and held it together. Lillian appeared in the doorway, took in the state of her, and without a word put the kettle on. They sat at the table with coffee while the rain came down outside, and Lillian told her, unprompted, about the year before her mother died. The good year, the one when the ranch had been running well and her father had been building an extension on the back of the house. How he'd sung sometimes while he worked. How her mother used to bring him coffee the same way Lillian was doing now, except her mother was better at it because she didn't spill. "I spill every time," Lillian said, looking at the evidence. "I spill too," Evelyn said. "I'm just fast at wiping it up." Lillian almost smiled. It was a near thing. "Did he finish the extension?" Evelyn asked. "No." Lillian wrapped her hands around her cup. "He stopped when she died. It's just framing out there. I don't think he can stand to look at it." Evelyn thought about that. about the framing at the back of the house that she hadn't asked about because she'd assumed it was a future project, about Nathaniel stopping mid-build because the person he was building for had gone, and then being unable to take it down and unable to finish it, and so just living with the skeleton of it outside. There were more layers to this than she'd understood at first. There always were. The week ended with a moment she hadn't expected. She was sitting on the front step at the end of a long day, the same place she'd sat that first evening, and Nathaniel came and stood in the doorway behind her. She'd gotten used to this, the way he sometimes appeared near her when the house was quiet, not quite joining her, but not quite leaving either. "Rosie asked me something today," he said. She waited. "She asked if you were going to stay." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him over her shoulder. "I told her I didn't know," he said. She turned back to look at the yard. The evening light was doing its thing again, that color, warning and beautiful at the same time. "What would make you know?" she asked. He didn't answer that. She hadn't really expected him to, but he also didn't go back inside, and after a few minutes she heard the sound of him sitting down on the top step, not quite next to her, but closer than he'd been before. And they sat there together, while the light went down and the dark came up and the ranch settled into its evening sounds around them. She thought about what Cecil had said on the way in that first day. A good wreck. She was starting to understand what he meant. Good people didn't automatically make good circumstances. Sometimes good people came apart under enough pressure, and the pieces fell in a pattern that looked from certain angles, like something that couldn't be put back together. But she'd always been better at angles than most people. She stayed on the step until it was fully dark. She did not leave. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, tucked between a seed catalog and a notice from the county assessor about property boundaries. Evelyn almost missed it. She'd been sorting the mail that Cecil Pruitt dropped at the gate whenever he passed, a loose arrangement that had somehow become regular. And she was reading the assessor's notice with half her attention because there was a discrepancy in the eastern boundary description that didn't match what Nathaniel had told her about the property line, and that kind of discrepancy was the sort of thing that turned into a problem if you let it sit long enough. The envelope was addressed to Miss Evelyn Mercer, care of the Voss Ranch, Calder's Bend, Texas. The handwriting was her cousin Ruth's. She recognized it from the slant of the capital letters, the way Ruth had always pressed too hard with her pen, as though she was afraid the words would escape if she didn't pin them down firmly enough. She set the assessor's notice aside and opened it. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back inside to start on dinner, because dinner still needed starting regardless of what any letter said, and she had learned a long time ago that the first thing you did with bad news was not to stop moving. Ruth's husband, Thomas, had broken his leg badly enough that the doctor in their town had used the word permanent in connection with the damage, which meant he would not be working the way he had before, which meant the farm was in trouble, which meant Ruth needed help and was not going to ask for it directly because Ruth had never asked for anything directly in her life. The letter said all of this in the careful language of a woman trying not to sound desperate, which made the desperation more obvious, not less. "I know you've just arrived," Ruth had written. "I wouldn't ask if there was anyone else." Evelyn made the biscuits. She made the gravy. She called the children in for dinner, and she sat at the table and ate and listened to Samuel tell Lillian something about a bird he'd seen near the north pasture. And she watched Rosie carefully position a biscuit on the edge of her plate so it wouldn't touch the gravy. She had strong feelings about her food not touching, and she didn't say anything about the letter at all. She didn't sleep much that night. The problem was not complicated, which was almost what made it harder. If the situation had been tangled and unclear, she'd have had room to reason her way around it. But it was plain. Ruth had no one else. Thomas was hurt. The farm, the small place they'd built over 15 years, was going to fail without help, and it was going to fail quickly because spring planning couldn't wait. And Evelyn was here, having spent 6 weeks building something that was only just beginning to be real, and the people in this house had only just begun to trust that she was not going to disappear. She went over it from every angle she could find. She looked at it from Ruth's side, and from the children's side, and from Nathaniel's side, and from the side of simple, practical obligation. She did not look at it from her own side for a long time, because what she wanted had not been a reliable guide for most of her adult life, and she'd learned to treat it with some skepticism. What she kept coming back to was Rosie's voice at 3 in the morning. "You stayed. She got up before dawn and went to the garden. It was becoming a habit, the garden in the early morning, before anyone else was awake, with the light just starting to come, and the air still cool, and the birds working through whatever they worked through at that hour. She'd found that she could think more clearly out here than almost anywhere else. Maybe it was the physical work. Maybe it was the fact that the garden was one of the places where she could see, directly and measurably, that something she'd done had mattered. The squash seedlings were up, the beans were establishing, the volunteer tomato that Rosie watered every morning had put out 3 new leaves in the last week. She was crouching there looking at nothing in particular when she heard the back door. She assumed Lillian, or possibly Samuel, who had taken to appearing in the kitchen earlier and earlier each morning as though he was testing how early was too early and had not yet found the limit. It was Nathaniel. He came across the yard with 2 cups of coffee, which was something he had never done before. The coffee was always her job, or Lillian's. And he handed her one without preamble and crouched down on the other side of the bean row and looked at the seedlings the way a man looks at something he's been thinking about and wanted to see with his own eyes. She took the coffee. "Beans are coming good," he said. "Another 2 weeks if the weather holds." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was when he was working up to something, and she waited because she'd learned that rushing him produced nothing useful. "You got a letter yesterday," he said, "from back east." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Lillian mentioned it. She saw you with it." He was watching the bean plants, not her. She said you didn't look like yourself after." She absorbed that. 11 years old and paying that close attention. She wasn't sure whether to feel watched or cared for, and then decided it was probably both. "It was from my cousin Ruth," she said. He waited. She told him. All of it, plainly. The husband's injury, the farm, the planting season that wouldn't wait. The letter that had said I wouldn't ask if there was anyone else in the handwriting of a woman who pressed too hard on every word. Nathaniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He drank his coffee and looked at the bean row, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long enough time that she began to wonder what he was doing with the silence. "How far is it?" he asked finally. "Missouri. 4 days by train, if the connections are good." He nodded. Another silence. "And you'd need to go." "I haven't decided anything," she said. He looked at her then. "You're out in the garden at 5 in the morning. You've decided something." She looked back at him. "I don't know what I've decided," she said, and it was the honest truth. "I know what I'm obligated to do, and I know what I—" She stopped. "What you what?" She set her coffee cup down on the ground beside her. "I've been in places where I was useful without being wanted," she said carefully. "This is different, and I'm not sure I can explain how much that matters to me or how much I'm afraid of—" She stopped again. He said quietly, "Afraid of what?" She looked at him across the bean row in the early morning light. "Of it not being here when I come back." The word back sat between them. He looked at it. She could tell by the way his jaw moved, the slight tension of a man processing something he hadn't expected. If you go, he said slowly, "and you come back." "I don't know that I can promise a timeline," she said. "Ruth needs real help, not a visit. That's going to take time." "How much time?" "I don't know. I don't know how bad the injury is or how long the planting will take or—" "Evelyn." He said her name for the first time without the particular distance he usually kept around it. Just her name, straight. "If you go, will you come back?" She heard the difference between the question and the way he'd said it. He wasn't asking about a timeline. He was asking something else. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He stood up. He didn't say anything else. He took his coffee and walked back to the house, and she sat in the garden for another few minutes, listening to the birds and looking at the bean seedlings and trying to understand what had just happened, because something had shifted between them and she wasn't sure she had the right word for what it was yet. She told the children at breakfast. She had decided to tell them all at once rather than one by one, because managing the same news 3 separate times seemed likely to make everyone more anxious, not less. She told them plainly. Her cousin needed help. She had to go for a while. She would be back. She said, "I will be back," with the same straightforwardness she'd have used for the beans will be ready in 2 weeks, because she'd found that children absorbed certainty differently than they absorbed reassurance. Rosie went very still. Lillian's face went carefully neutral. the expression she defaulted to when she needed time to decide how she felt about something. Samuel put his fork down. "How long is a while?" Rosie asked. "I don't know exactly, sweetheart. A few weeks. Maybe a little more." "A few weeks is a long time." "It is," Evelyn agreed. She didn't argue with it. Rosie was right. "What if you don't come back?" Samuel said. He said it flat, the way he said things when he was trying to sound like they didn't matter to him. "I'll come back." The other women didn't. The other women left because they chose to. "I'm going because someone I love needs help. That's a different thing." He looked at her for a moment. "How is it different?" She thought about how to say it. "Because coming back was always part of my plan," she said. "Leaving wasn't. There's a difference between going somewhere and going away." He picked his fork back up. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he also didn't say anything else, and she'd learned that Samuel's silences were not necessarily resistance. Sometimes they were just the sound of him thinking. Lillian helped her pack. She didn't offer. She just appeared in Evelyn's room an hour after breakfast and started folding the clothes that Evelyn had laid out on the bed with a methodical efficiency that was so familiar by now it made something in Evelyn's chest ache a little. "You know where everything is," Lillian said. She meant it as a statement of fact. "You know where the soap is and where we keep the extra cornmeal and what to do when the East Cow won't give." She said it like she was trying to memorize everything Evelyn knew and transfer it to herself in advance. "You know too," Evelyn said. "You knew most of it before I got here. I just rearranged some things." Lillian folded a blouse with unnecessary precision. "The bread. You need to remind about the shelf." I wrote it down. Evelyn had spent the previous evening making a list, not a short one, of every practical thing she'd learned about the house and the animals and the garden since she'd arrived. The quirks and the workarounds, and the things that seemed fine but weren't, and the things that seemed like problems but would resolve on their own. She'd put it in the kitchen where Lillian would find it. "It's by the coffee tin." Lillian nodded. She kept folding. "I can manage," she said after a while. "I know you can." Evelyn paused. "But you shouldn't have to. That's still true." The morning she left, Rosie clung to her dress. Not dramatically. Not the throwing herself at her kind of clinging that small children sometimes did. Just a quiet, steady hold on the fabric of Evelyn's skirt, both hands, the way you hold on to something you're not sure is really yours to hold on to, but you're going to hold anyway. Evelyn crouched down. "I'll write to you," she said. "Can you read cursive yet?" Rosie shook her head. "Lillian can read it to you." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind Rosie's ear. "I'm coming back. I need you to believe that." Rosie looked at her with those enormous eyes that saw everything and filed it away. "Will you bring something?" "What do you want?" Rosie thought about it with the seriousness that she brought to most things. "Seeds," she said. "For the garden. Something I haven't grown before." "Seeds," Evelyn said. "That I can do." She stood and looked at the three of them standing in a row on the porch. Lillian composed, Samuel scowling in the particular way he scowled when he was trying not to feel things, Rosie still holding a small piece of her skirt until the distance finally pulled it out of her grip. Nathaniel had the wagon ready. He drove her to the station himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed Cecil would take her, or that she'd arrange something. They rode most of the way in silence, which had become, in 6 weeks, a comfortable thing rather than an uncomfortable one. The particular quality of silence between people who have been through something together was different from the silence between strangers, and they both understood this without discussing it. Halfway to the station, he said, "I told Rosie you'd be back." She looked at him. "Before you talked to them at breakfast," he said. "She came to find me last night. She'd heard you up, I think. She knew something was happening." He kept his eyes on the road. "I told her you were going to help someone and you'd come back." "You didn't know that for certain?" "No." A pause. "But I'd rather be wrong about that than have her go into it, not believing it." She looked at the road ahead, the familiar brush, the sky that was starting to develop clouds from the west, which meant rain later, but not before she'd made the train. "Thank you," she said. At the station, he got down and brought her suitcase from the wagon bed and set it on the platform. The train wasn't there yet. She had 20 minutes. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the empty track like he was waiting for it to tell him what to say. "The east fence line," he said finally. I'll get to it this week. Good. And the chicken coop repair. I started framing it out. I saw. It looks solid. He nodded. They were talking about fence lines and chicken coops because they were people who understood that sometimes the things you meant were easier to carry inside practical language, and both of them had gotten good enough at this particular kind of conversation to know what it contained. The garden will need water if the rain doesn't come through, she said. I'll tell Samuel. He'll do it. He just needs someone to ask. I know. He was quiet. I've been learning to ask. She looked at him. He was looking at the track, and his profile in the morning light had the particular quality of someone who had made up his mind about something and was simply waiting for the right moment to know what it was. The train whistle came from somewhere down the line, still far off, but audible. Nathaniel, she said. He looked at her. The house is going to be fine, she said. The children are going to be fine. She held his gaze. You're going to be fine. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a name for. I'm less certain of that than you are, he said. I know. She picked up her suitcase. That's why I said it and not you. She thought she heard, just barely, something that might have been a quiet laugh. She didn't turn around to check. She walked toward this platform, and she didn't let herself look back more than once. And when she did look, he was still standing by the wagon watching the track. And she turned forward again and kept walking because the train was coming and she had somewhere to be. The 4 days on the train were the longest she could remember in years. She'd thought she'd find the solitude restoring. She'd had very little of it in the last 6 weeks. But what she actually found was that she'd become accustomed to the rhythms of that house in ways she hadn't fully registered until she was outside of them. She missed the sound of the kitchen in the morning. She missed Rosie's footsteps behind her in the yard. She found herself mentally checking on the garden at the times she usually checked on it, and noting what needed doing at the ranch at the times those things needed doing. And the realization of how thoroughly that place had gotten into her pattern of thinking was, in its way, a relief. It told her something she'd half known and hadn't wanted to name too soon. Ruth's farm was worse than the letter had suggested. Thomas's leg had been broken in 2 places when the horse came down on it, and the doctor's use of the word permanent had meant that he'd never have full strength in it again. Not enough to work a farm the way a farm needed working. He was up and moving on a crutch, but the pain was written on him constantly in the tight set of his jaw and the way he sat down too quickly whenever he thought no one was watching. He was 44 years old, and the farm was what he knew, and the idea that he might not be able to keep it was something he and Ruth were both carrying without being able to put down. Ruth was thinner than Evelyn remembered. She'd always been the rounder, softer of the two of them, the one who cried at stories and fed every stray that wandered into the yard. She was still those things, but there was a worn quality underneath them now, the look of someone who had been running on less than enough for too long. She hugged Evelyn at the door and didn't say anything for a moment, which was unusual for Ruth, who normally filled every silence within 3 seconds. I didn't think you'd actually come, she said finally. After I sent it, I thought, you've just gotten there, you've just started. I'm here, Evelyn said. I'll figure out how to make it up to you. Ruth. She held her cousin by the shoulders and looked at her directly. You don't owe me anything. You took me in when Mama died. You fed me for 3 months while I found work. We're not keeping score. Ruth pressed her lips together. She was going to cry and was working against it. The planting is so far behind, she said. I know. Show me what needs doing first. They spent the first week doing what Evelyn had done at the Voss Ranch 6 weeks earlier, assessing the actual size of the problem rather than the imagined size of it. The imagined size was always bigger and less workable. The actual size, when you broke it into pieces, was still large but had seams you could get your hands into. She organized the planting schedule around Thomas's capacity. He could sit and sort seeds, he could manage the hand pump, he could drive the wagon short distances, and built everything else around what she and Ruth could do between them. She wrote to Lillian on the 6th day. She wrote formally, a little, because Lillian responded well to formality. It was a form of respect that the girl recognized. She asked specific questions about the garden and the animals, the kind that required specific answers, because she'd found that asking how are things going produced nothing useful from a person like Lillian, but asking how are the bean seedlings looking and has the East Cow been giving well-produced a full page of careful, detailed response that contained everything you needed to know about how things were actually going. Lillian's letter came back in 11 days. The bean seedlings were doing well. The East cow had had a bad week and then recovered. Samuel had been watering the garden every morning without being reminded after the second day. Rosie had cried twice, but not in a way that was worrying, only in the way of missing someone, and she'd stopped when Lillian read her Evelyn's letter and seemed to find it satisfactory. Nathaniel had fixed the east fence and finished the chicken coop repair, and he'd also started on the extension at the back of the house. Just the framing and the floor, not the walls yet, but it was more than he'd done on it in 2 years. Evelyn read that part twice. She wasn't sure exactly what it meant, but she thought she understood it in the way you understand things that people do rather than things they say. She wrote back that night. The weeks at Ruth's farm settled into a rhythm. Hard physical work, the kind that she'd grown accustomed to at the Voss Ranch, but was surprised to find she'd missed the specific version of because Ruth's farm was different country, different soil, different problems. And then the evenings at the kitchen table with Ruth and Thomas, who turned out to be, when he wasn't in pain and defensive about it, a genuinely funny man with opinions about everything, and no reluctance to share them. She'd expected to feel like she was in the right place, doing the right thing. She did feel that. She also felt, underneath it, the steady particular pull of somewhere else. It surprised her, the first time she noticed it clearly. She'd spent so much of her adult life being somewhere that felt like a temporary arrangement that she wasn't sure she knew how to recognize a place that was different. She was recognizing it now, backward by its absence. She wrote to Nathaniel once. It took her 3 evenings to write. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she was careful about what she said, and she'd found that careful letters required more time than careless ones. She told him about Thomas and Ruth. She told him about the farm and the planting progress. She told him that the soil here was heavier than Texas soil, and that she'd gotten blisters in different places than she did at the ranch, which was her way of saying that work shaped itself to the land it was done on, and different places required different versions of you. She told him that she thought about the East Garden, that she'd been wondering about the squash, that she'd been meaning to ask whether the water pump had given him any more trouble. She did not say what she was actually saying because she wasn't sure the letter was the right place for it, but she suspected he'd understand because he was better at the language underneath language than people generally gave him credit for. His letter came back in 9 days. He wrote the way he spoke. Economy of words, nothing wasted. The squash was coming well. The pump had not given trouble. Samuel had started helping with the morning feeding without being asked, and Lillian had made the Johnny cakes twice and gotten them right both times. He had seen the assessor about the boundary discrepancy she'd flagged in the notice, the one she'd mentioned to him before she left, and it had turned out to be a surveying error from 15 years ago that now needed to be formally corrected before the county filed it, and it became binding. He was dealing with it, and at the end, one line, Rosie has been checking the mailbox every day since your first letter came. Evelyn sat with that letter for a long time. It was the middle of her 4th week at Ruth's farm when things shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated. Thomas had a bad day, worse than the usual bad days, the kind where the pain was high enough that he couldn't pretend it wasn't, and the pretending was the thing that kept the fear from being visible. Ruth was tight with worry, the quiet, contained worry of a woman who had decided to be strong about something and was paying for the decision. Evelyn had found them at this kitchen table that evening in a silence that had clearly started as an argument and finished as the particular exhausted truce of 2 people who loved each other and had run out of fight. She'd made tea and sat with them and not asked what was wrong because she could see what was wrong, and sometimes people needed company more than they needed questions. Thomas had said, into the quiet, "We might need to think about selling." Ruth had looked at the table. "The farm," he'd said, as though it needed clarifying. Evelyn had looked at him. "Have you talked to anyone about what it would take to restructure things? The planting, the equipment? If you're not going to be doing the heavy work yourself, there are different ways to run the same land." Thomas had looked at her. "Like what?" "Like not doing it all yourself." She'd spent some time thinking about this since she'd arrived, because it was the kind of problem she thought about whether or not anyone asked her to. You've got good soil. You've got the infrastructure. You could lease part of it to a neighbor with the right to farm it and keep a portion of the yield. You keep the land. You keep the income. You're not carrying the physical load of working all of it. She'd paused. I don't know the neighbors here well enough to know who'd be right for that kind of arrangement. But you do. Thomas had looked at Ruth. Ruth had looked at Evelyn. There'd been a long silence, and then Thomas had said, "Harlan Deese." "The one with the 3 sons," Ruth had said. "He's been looking to expand. He's got the manpower." They'd talked for 2 more hours. Not about giving up, about something different. After, when Thomas had gone to bed and she and Ruth were doing the dishes, Ruth had said, "You didn't have to do that." "It's what I'd want someone to do," Evelyn had said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "How are they? The family in Texas?" "They're managing." "Are you needed there?" Evelyn had been washing the same plate for about 20 seconds longer than necessary. "Yes," she said. Ruth had looked at her sideways. There'd been a quality in her cousin's expression that Evelyn recognized from 30 years of knowing her, the particular look of Ruth having noticed something and deciding whether to say it. She'd said it. "Then you should go." "You still need—" "We'll talk to Harlan Deese next week. If that works out, and I think it will, we'll manage." Ruth had taken the plate from her and dried it herself. "Evelyn, you've been looking at that window every morning since you got here." She'd started to say something and then hadn't. "Go," Ruth had said. Not unkindly. "You've done what you came to do. Go back to the thing you actually came from." She'd written to Nathaniel that night. She'd told him she was coming home. She'd used the word without deciding to. It had come out on the page before she'd made any conscious choice about it. Home. She'd looked at it for a moment and then left it there because it was the right word, and removing it would have been dishonest. She'd also written, at the end, "There's something I want to say to you when I get there that I'm not going to put in a letter. It can wait. But I want you to know it's coming." She'd posted it the next morning. The train back to Texas took 4 days and felt like 10. She watched the landscape change back, the heavy green of Missouri giving way to the prairie flatness of the territory, and then the brush and the low sky and the particular quality of the Texas air that she hadn't known she'd been missing until the train window started showing it to her. She pressed her hand against the glass at one point without entirely meaning to, like she could touch it through the window. She arrived at the Harlan Creek station in the late afternoon on a Thursday. The platform was quiet. She stepped off with her suitcase and looked around. Cecil Pruitt's wagon was not there. The platform was empty. She stood there for a moment with her suitcase at her feet, and she thought, all right, that's how it is. You knew the distance might have changed something. She picked up the suitcase and started toward the general store to see about arranging a ride. She was 30 feet from the platform when she heard it, the sound of a wagon moving fast, not recklessly, but with the particular speed of someone who was trying to cover ground without looking like they were hurrying. She turned around. Nathaniel had the reins. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, and there was dust on his coat and on his boots, and his hair was not entirely in order, which meant he'd come quickly and from a distance. And he stood on the platform looking at her with the expression of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and had now completely forgotten it. Rosie was in the wagon. Wait for anyone to tell her what to do. She climbed over the side with the total disregard for personal safety that 6-year-olds brought to everything, and she ran across the platform and wrapped herself around Evelyn's waist and held on. Evelyn set the suitcase down and held her back. Over the top of Rosie's head, she looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at her. "You're late," he said. "The train was supposed to come at 3. The junction at Beaumont was slow. Some issue with the freight. Rosie's been asking every hour since this morning. I'm sorry. Don't apologize." He picked up her suitcase. "There's something in the garden you need to see," he said, and he carried her suitcase to the wagon and put it in and waited. She detached herself gently from Rosie, who allowed it but kept hold of her hand, and they walked to the wagon together. She climbed up, and Rosie climbed up beside her and leaned against her with the uncomplicated weight of a child who had decided where they belonged and was not interested in discussing it. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, different quiet from the drive to the station 2 weeks before. Fuller. The kind of quiet that had things in it. About halfway home, Rosie fell asleep against her arm. She looked down at the child and then up at the road, and then sideways at Nathaniel, who was watching the road with both hands on the reins and something in his jaw that had loosened a little since the station. "What's in the garden?" she asked quietly, so as not to wake Rosie. He glanced at her. "The squash came in," he said. "First one this morning. It's a good one." She looked at the road ahead. The ranch appeared as it always did in the late afternoon light. The fields first, then the outbuildings, then the house. She noticed immediately that the extension framing had more to it than the last time she'd seen it. Not walls yet, but the floor was laid and there were studs going up along the south side, and someone had done careful work on the corner joints. She noticed the garden from the road, greener than when she'd left. She noticed the chicken coop looking solid. Samuel and Lillian were on the porch when the wagon came into the yard. Samuel raised a hand in a gesture that was trying very hard not to be a wave, and was, in fact, a wave. Lillian stood with her arms at her sides and watched the wagon pull up, and then, when Evelyn climbed down, walked across the yard to her with the deliberate pace of a person who had decided to do something and was committed to it, and hugged her. A brief, firm hug, the kind that communicated the exact amount of feeling that Lillian was prepared to show, and not a word more, but it was real and complete, and Evelyn held on for the 4 or 5 seconds that it lasted. "The bread's been coming out right," Lillian said, stepping back. "I knew it would." "The beans are almost ready." "The squash came in," Rosie said from behind her, waking up at the exact moment she wasn't needed to say anything. "Papa said it's the good kind." "I heard," Evelyn said. Nathaniel carried her suitcase up the porch steps and through the front door, and Evelyn followed him, and the house smelled like something baking and like the particular smell of a house that had been inhabited with some care recently. Not perfect, nothing was perfect, but tended. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Nathaniel set the suitcase at the foot of the stairs and turned around. They were standing in the main room, just the two of them. The children were still outside, Rosie explaining something at length to Samuel, Lillian already heading toward the kitchen. "The letter," he said. She'd wondered when they'd get to it. "You said there was something you were going to say when you got back." He was looking at her with the same steadiness he brought to most things, the kind that looked like calm but had something underneath it that she'd learned to recognize. "I'd like to hear it." She looked at him. "I used the word home," she said, "in the letter, when I said I was coming back. I noticed that." "I meant it," she said, "not the arrangement, not the practical situation." She held his gaze. "I meant this. The children, the garden, the chicken coop and the east fence, and the fact that you apparently started on that extension." She paused. "And you." He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen door banged open somewhere behind them, and Rosie's voice came in from the yard, explaining something with great authority to Samuel, who was clearly not interested. "I want to do this right," Nathaniel said finally. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who had thought about something a long time and was not going to fumble the saying of it. "I don't know how to do that exactly. I haven't—" He stopped. "It's been a long time since I knew how to do any of this." "I know," she said. "I'm probably going to be difficult." "I've noticed." Something shifted in his face, the almost laugh she'd seen once or twice before, more present now than it had been. "You don't seem particularly bothered by that." "I'm not easy either," she said. "We'll manage." He looked at her for a moment, then he reached out and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way you do something when you mean it precisely because you're not making a speech about it. "Supper," Lillian called from the kitchen. "Whenever you're done standing there." Evelyn pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. Nathaniel's hand was still over hers for one more second. Then they both moved toward the kitchen, where the children were already arguing about who got to sit where, and something was burning slightly on the stove in the way things did when Lillian was managing too many things at once, and the house was loud and imperfect and entirely real, and Evelyn walked into the middle of it and knew, without question and without reservation, that she was exactly where she intended to be. The days after Evelyn came back settled differently than the days before she'd left. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing announced itself. But there was a quality to the house now that hadn't been there before. Not ease exactly, because ease was still some distance off and all of them knew it, but something more like purpose. The way a room feels when someone has opened a window that had been stuck shut for a long time. The air moves differently. You didn't notice how stale it had gotten until suddenly it wasn't. She noticed it first in small things, the way she always noticed things first. Samuel was up before her on the Friday morning after her return, already in the barn when she came out at first light, doing the feeding with the quiet competence of a boy who had been doing it alone for 2 weeks and had decided he was going to keep doing it. He didn't make a speech about this. He just handed her the empty grain bucket when she came through the barn door and said, "East Cow gave well this morning," and went back to what he was doing. She took the bucket and looked at him for a moment, 9 years old, working like someone twice that. "You did good while I was gone," she said. He shrugged. "The animals don't care if you feel like doing it." "No," she agreed. "They don't." She thought about that on the walk back to the house. He'd learned that from somewhere, probably from watching his father in the years since his mother died. Watching Nathaniel keep getting up and doing the work regardless of what the work cost him. Children absorbed everything, whether you meant them to or not. The question was always what they absorbed and what they made of it. The squash was better than Nathaniel's letter had suggested. She'd gone to the garden the evening she got back, after supper, after the children were settled, and she'd crouched down in the east corner and looked at it in the last of the light. 3 fruits, 1 already fully sized, 2 coming along behind it. The soil around them was darker than the rest of the garden, which meant someone had been watering carefully, which meant Samuel had understood more from watching her than she'd realized. The volunteer tomato that Rosie tended had set fruit. The beans were ready to pull. She'd sat in the garden for a while in the growing dark and felt something she hadn't expected, gratitude. Not performed gratitude, the kind you said out loud because it was the right thing to say. The kind that sat in your chest quietly and didn't need an audience. The issue that came up in the second week after her return was one she'd been anticipating but had hoped to have more time before. It was Ada Pruitt who brought it to her. Ada came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning under the pretext of returning a pot that Lillian had apparently lent her at some point, though Evelyn had no memory of this transaction and suspected the pot was more occasion than reason. Ada Pruitt came in, set the pot on the table, accepted the coffee that Evelyn offered, and looked around the kitchen with the thorough assessment of a woman who considered knowing the state of other people's households a public service. "You came back," Ada said. "I did." "People said you wouldn't." Evelyn looked at her over her coffee cup. "What people?" Ada waved a hand. "People. You know how it is. 2 women before you left and didn't come back, and then you went to Missouri. There was talk." She said it without apology, because Ada Pruitt did not apologize for the existence of talk. She simply reported it as weather. "Some people said Nathaniel ran you off. Some people said the children were impossible. Vera Hatch said you'd found something better in Missouri and weren't coming back, but Vera Hatch says things like that about everyone, so I don't count her." "What did you say?" Evelyn asked. Ada considered. "I said I didn't know you well enough to be certain, but that you didn't strike me as someone who left things unfinished." She paused. "I was right." "You were." "The arrangement," Ada said, with the directness of a woman who had decided the conversational approach wasn't getting her where she wanted to go. "Between you and Nathaniel, it's still just the arrangement?" Evelyn set down her cup. "That's between me and Nathaniel." "It is," Ada agreed, entirely unruffled. "But I'll tell you something, and you can do with it what you like. This county has a way of making things harder than they need to be for people whose situations are unclear. A woman living in a man's house under an arrangement that hasn't moved forward, people talk about that kind of thing, and talking turns into something else eventually." She met Evelyn's eyes directly. "I'm not saying it to pry. I'm saying it because I watched Margaret Voss fight for this family's standing in this town for 8 years, and I'd hate to see it undone by something that didn't need to be complicated." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you saying it plainly," she said. "I don't know how to say things any other way." Ada finished her coffee and stood up. "The pot's clean. Your Johnny cakes smell good." She left. Evelyn sat at the table for a while after. She had known, in a general way, that the situation had edges that needed addressing. She and Nathaniel had spoken honestly in the doorway the evening she returned, and something had shifted between them. The hand over hers had been real. The words had been real. But nothing had been formalized, and nothing had been said about what came next. She'd told herself there was time for that things would find their shape. Ada's visit reminded her that things didn't always find their shape on their own. Sometimes you had to go looking for it. She talked to Nathaniel that evening, not immediately after supper, which was always a complicated time. Rosie had strong opinions about who sat where, and those opinions changed without notice. And Samuel had started an argument with Lillian about something so minor, she'd already forgotten what it was. And Nathaniel had spent most of dinner looking like a man managing a situation from a significant distance. She waited until the children were in bed, and the kitchen was clean, and the house had gone quiet in the way it did late in the evening, and she found him on the porch. He was sitting on the top step, not the way she usually sat there. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the yard, and there was something in his posture that said he'd been thinking about something for a while. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "Ada Pruitt came today," she said. "I heard the wagon. She brought a pot back. She doesn't own a pot that size. She borrowed it as an excuse." He said it without heat. "What did she say?" Evelyn told him. All of it, in the same plain language Ada had used, because there was no useful way to soften it, and she didn't want to. When she finished, Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard. "She's right," he said. "I thought so too." He turned to look at her. In the low evening light, his face had the particular quality it got when he was being honest about something that cost him something. "I've been waiting," he said. "For what?" "To be sure I wasn't—" He stopped, tried again. "Margaret has been gone 2 years, and I spent those 2 years telling myself I was fine, and the children were fine, and the ranch was fine, which was a lie across the board, but it was a lie I knew how to live in." He looked at the yard again. "Then you came, and things started being different, and I didn't know how to trust that." "Do you trust it now?" she asked. He was quiet. "Mostly," he said, "which is more than I expected." She nodded. "Mostly is enough." "Is it?" "It's honest," she said. "I'd rather have mostly and honest than completely and not." He looked at her. There was something in his expression she'd been seeing more of lately, something open and direct that had been buried under the careful distance for a long time and was surfacing now in pieces, the way a field thaws in early spring, not all at once, but in patches. "I want to do this properly," he said, "not as a practical arrangement, not as the thing I told you it was when you got off the train." He let out a breath. "I want you to be my wife, actually, not for the sake of the children or the county or anything else, for the sake for what this is." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then ask me," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. He reached into his coat pocket, and she realized then that he'd been sitting out here before she came because he'd been preparing, not just thinking, and that this conversation had not been as spontaneous as it appeared. He held out his hand. In it was a ring, plain, not expensive, a thin band of silver that was clearly not new. It had the particular quality of something that had been owned a long time. "This was my mother's," he said. "Margaret had her own. This one has been in a box in the bottom of the dresser since she died." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for a few weeks." She looked at the ring. "It's not much," he said. "It's real," she said. "That's more than not much." She held out her hand and he put the ring on her finger, and it fit imperfectly, a little loose, and she curled her fingers slightly to keep it in place. They sat on the porch step and looked at the dark yard and didn't say much else. And it was exactly the right amount of ceremony for two people who understood that the real things had already been said in gardens and kitchens and on wagon rides and in letters. After a while, Rosie's voice came from the upstairs window. "Is someone out there?" "Go to sleep, Rosie," Nathaniel said. A pause. "Are you talking about something?" "Yes." "Can I know what?" "Tomorrow," he said. A longer pause. "Is it good or bad?" "Go to sleep." Silence. Then, "I'm going to assume it's good." Evelyn pressed her lips together. Nathaniel's shoulder moved very slightly beside her, the silent laugh she'd learned to read. "She's not wrong," Evelyn said quietly. "No," he agreed. "She's not." They told the children at breakfast. Nathaniel told them, which she'd suggested the night before, not because she wanted to remove herself from it, but because it needed to come from him, for his sake and for theirs. He sat down at the table before the food was ready, which was unusual. He normally came to the table when things were already on it, and looked at the three of them in a way that made Lillian go still immediately, because Lillian's threat assessment instincts were finely calibrated and any deviation from pattern got her attention. "I asked Evelyn to marry me last night," he said. "Not the arrangement, actually. She said yes." Rosie processed this for about half a second and then said, "I knew it," with the confidence of someone who had been right about something they'd been hoping about for a long time. Samuel looked at his plate. He was working through something. She watched his jaw tighten and his hands go flat on the table, and she waited. "Does that mean she's staying?" he asked. He said it at the plate, not at his father. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Not going anywhere else. Not for a while, and then—" "Samuel." Nathaniel's voice was firm but not hard. "She's staying. This is her home." Samuel looked up. He looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing she could say that would be more convincing than what time would provide, and she thought he was old enough to know that. After a moment, he nodded. Lillian had been quiet through all of it, her hands in her lap, looking at the table. When the others had moved on, Rosie already asking questions about whether there would be a celebration and what kind of food that would involve. Lillian looked up at Evelyn across the table. She didn't say anything, but she looked at Evelyn's hand, at the ring that was sitting slightly loose on her finger, and something in her face went soft in a way it almost never did, and she nodded once, the way she nodded when she'd made up her mind about something. That was enough. The town of Calder's Bend received the news in the way small towns received most news, thoroughly, and with a range of opinions. Ada Pruitt, who was as close as the county had to an official information center, seemed to regard it as a satisfactory resolution to something she'd been monitoring. Cecil Pruitt brought a jar of honey to the ranch without explanation and left it on the gatepost. The woman at the dry goods store, who had always looked at Evelyn with the sideways assessment of someone deciding whether an outsider deserved to be taken seriously, said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Voss," the next time she came in, unprompted, and Evelyn had managed not to visibly react to the name. Mrs. Voss. She turned it over in her mind on the ride home. She'd spent 31 years being Miss Mercer, which for most of those years had felt like a description of what she was not rather than what she was. Mrs. Voss was something different. It was not a diminishment and not a replacement. It was an addition, something that contained the woman she'd been and recognized the place she'd arrived. She'd take it. The problem that arrived 3 weeks after that was one she should have anticipated but hadn't, which bothered her in retrospect because she was usually better at seeing problems before they arrived. Nathaniel had a brother. His name was Garrett Voss, and he lived in a town about 40 miles east on what had been their father's property. And he arrived at the ranch on a Thursday afternoon without warning, driving a good wagon with good horses, wearing the look of a man who had done well enough to be comfortable and was accustomed to being noticed. He was 2 years older than Nathaniel, broader through the chest and shorter, with the same jaw but less patience in it. He came into the yard and looked at the house and the garden and the repaired fence and the new framing on the extension with the systematic look of a man doing an assessment, and Evelyn, who was in the garden when he arrived, watched him do it before he noticed her. He noticed her. "You'd be the new wife," he said. Not unkindly, but without warmth either, the tone of a man stating a category. "Evelyn Voss," she said. She still felt the newness of the name, but she used it without hesitation. He looked her over in the way that some men did, the kind of look that was not improper but was not respectful either, just a survey. "Garrett Voss, Nathaniel's brother." He looked at the house. "He around?" "He's at the north pasture. He'll be back by dinner." "I'll wait." She did not invite him to sit on the porch, and he did not ask to. He walked around the yard looking at things, and she returned to the garden and watched him from the corner of her eye and tried to figure out what he was here for, because a man who drove 40 miles without warning was generally not just visiting. When Nathaniel came in from the north pasture and saw his brother's wagon, his face went through something quick and complicated that he controlled before he got close enough for Garrett to see it. Evelyn saw it. She'd gotten good at reading Nathaniel's face precisely because he worked so hard to keep it unreadable. The brothers shook hands. There was nothing warm in it, not hostile, but the handshake of two people who shared history and had complicated feelings about it. "Garrett," Nathaniel said, "you're looking better than the last time I saw you." "When was that?" "Margaret's funeral." Nathaniel said nothing to that. "I heard you remarried." Garrett glanced toward where Evelyn had gone back to the garden. "Mail order business. Pa would have had things to say about that." "Pa's not here," Nathaniel said. "No." Garrett looked at the house. "The place looks better than I heard." "Where are you hearing things from?" "County Assessor's Office, partly. There was a boundary issue filed. I resolved that. I know you resolved it. I'm saying that's how I heard things were." Garrett paused, recalibrating. "I'm saying people talk." "They always have," Nathaniel said. "What are you here for, Garrett?" His brother looked at him for a moment. There was something in his face now that was less certain than the assessment look he'd come in with. Pa left something behind, he said, in the estate. Something I've been sitting on for 2 years that I probably should have sent you before now. Nathaniel went still. What is it? Letters. Garrett reached into his coat. Margaret wrote to Pa before she died. He never told you because he figured it wasn't his business to give you things from your own wife, which was his way of avoiding things he didn't know how to handle. He held out an envelope, not a single letter but several, folded together. He died last spring. I found them in his desk. Nathaniel looked at the envelope. He didn't take it immediately. Evelyn had come to the garden fence without meaning to. She was close enough to hear, not close enough to be in the middle of it, and she stayed where she was because this was not her moment. It was his, and the best thing she could do for him right now was not interrupt. Nathaniel took the envelope. He looked at it for a moment like he was trying to decide something. Then he said, "Come in for dinner." Garrett came in for dinner. It was objectively the most complicated dinner table the Voss kitchen had hosted since Evelyn arrived. Garrett was the kind of man who filled a room with his own certainty about himself, and the children responded to this in their characteristic ways. Rosie studied him openly with no awareness that this was impolite. Samuel retreated to near silence, but with a sharper edge than usual, and Lillian served food with the controlled efficiency of a girl who had decided to reserve judgment but was accumulating evidence. Garrett talked a great deal about his operation, the ranch he'd grown from their father's property, the cattle numbers, a deal he was working with a man in Fort Worth. He directed most of this at Nathaniel, who listened with the contained attention he brought to most things. Occasionally, Garrett would say something in Evelyn's direction. Nathaniel tells me you're from Abilene originally, or you've done something with this kitchen. With the quality of a man who was revising an opinion he'd formed quickly without quite being ready to admit it. After dinner, when the children had gone upstairs and Evelyn was in the kitchen finishing the dishes, she could hear the brothers on the porch. Not the words exactly. The tone, low, careful, the specific register of two men who had learned to be guarded with each other and were operating inside that habit. Lillian appeared beside her with a dish towel. "He's not as bad as he seems," Lillian said. Evelyn looked at her. "How do you figure?" "He called Papa Nate when he thought no one was listening. He only does that when they were kids." She dried a cup. "I remember him from before. He was different then, more like Papa." She paused. "People get harder when they're by themselves for too long." Evelyn looked at her. 11 years old and talking like someone who had been watching people her whole life, which she had been in. "When did you get so wise?" Lillian looked faintly pleased and immediately tried to conceal it. "I just pay attention," she said. Garrett left the next morning. He came to find Evelyn before he hitched his wagon, which she hadn't expected. She was at the well, and he came across the yard and stood a few feet away with his hat in his hands, which changed the quality of him considerably. "He's different," Garrett said, without preamble, which turned out to be his actual style when he wasn't performing. "Then what?" she asked. "Then 2 years ago. Then any time in the last several years, maybe." He looked at the house. "After Margaret died, I came once. He didn't let me in, not literally, but..." He turned his hat in his hands. "I didn't know what to do with that, so I stayed away." "He wasn't ready," she said. "No, but I used it as an excuse." He paused. "I should have come sooner. When someone puts distance between you, sometimes the right thing is to close it anyway." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "You've done something here. I don't know exactly what or how, but..." He shook his head slightly. "My brother laughed at dinner last night." "I noticed," she said. "I haven't seen him do that in years." He put his hat back on. "I'm glad he found you. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that." She nodded. "Come back," she said. "Come at Christmas if you can make the trip. The children would be better for knowing their uncle." He looked surprised, then not. "I'll consider it," he said. He drove off down the track and she stood at the well and watched the wagon go and thought about what he'd said. When someone puts distance between you, sometimes the right thing is to close it anyway. She'd known that. But hearing it from a man who'd been wrong about it was a different kind of knowing. The letters were the real thing. Nathaniel didn't mention them that day or the next, and she didn't ask. She understood that some things needed to be held privately before they could be shared, and the letters from a dead wife to a dead father-in-law were precisely that kind of thing. She gave him the room to be with them however he needed to be. On the third evening after Garrett left, he came to find her in the garden at dusk. She was pulling the last of the bean plants. They'd finished fruiting and the plants were spent, and stacking them at the edge of the plot to compost. He came and crouched beside her and helped without asking whether she wanted help, which was how he always helped now. She'd noticed the shift. In the early weeks, he'd either stayed away or done things entirely on his own, but he'd started working alongside her in the last month in the quiet way of a man who'd decided that being near someone was a form of something he didn't yet have the language for. She knew she was going to die, he said. She kept pulling the spent plants. Not immediately, but she wrote to my father 6 weeks before the fever. She said she'd been having headaches and something was wrong, and she didn't know what it was, but she had a feeling. He was looking at the soil. She told him she was afraid Nathaniel would, that she was afraid I wouldn't know how to keep going, that I would. He stopped. She said I was the kind of man who needed someone to be steady for, that without that I'd lose myself in the work and forget to be a person. Evelyn was quiet. She told my father that if anything happened to her, she said he should trust that I'd find my way eventually, that I was stubborn but not stupid. He made a short sound, half breath and half laugh. That's a direct quote. She knew you, Evelyn said. Better than I knew myself, apparently. He was quiet for a moment. She said she didn't want the children raised in a house that was grieving forever. She said she wanted them to have someone, not a replacement. She was very specific about that. She said a replacement would be an insult to everyone involved. She wanted someone who could be something new alongside what had been. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at the empty beanstalks in his hands. I've been carrying it wrong, he said. The grief. I thought keeping everything exactly as it was the right way to honor her. I thought moving forward was the same as forgetting. He set the stalks down. The letters say different. She was right, Evelyn said. I know. He looked at her. I know that now. She reached over and put her hand over his where it was resting on the soil. The same gesture he'd made to her on the porch the night he'd asked her to stay. It was deliberate. She wanted him to feel the return of it. He turned his hand and held hers. They stayed like that for a minute in the quiet garden, with the evening coming down around them and the empty bean plants stacked at the edge of the plot, and the squash heavy in the east corner, and the tomatoes that Rosie tended still holding the last of their fruit in the low light. I owe you an apology, he said. For what? For the first day. I told you this was a practical arrangement. I said it like... He shook his head. I was telling you your worth in advance, and I was wrong. She looked at him. You were a man trying to hold himself together. That's not an excuse. No, but it's a reason. She squeezed his hand once and let go and stood up, because the light was going and there was still work. We're not keeping score, she said. That's the thing about actually choosing someone. You stop keeping score. He stood up too. They walked back to the house with the dusk behind them, and from somewhere upstairs Rosie was singing something in the wandering half-melody way of a child who didn't know she was doing it, and the kitchen light was on where Lillian was starting to put things together for the morning, and Samuel's boots were on the porch steps in the way that drove Lillian insane, and he knew it and did it anyway. Nathaniel stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the house. Really looked at it, the way you looked at something you'd been too close to see for a long time. Margaret would have liked you, he said. Evelyn looked up at the house too. I think I'd have liked her, she said. They went inside. The next morning, Evelyn found something she hadn't been looking for. She was reorganizing the back storage, a project she'd been putting off because the back storage was where things went to stop being dealt with, and it had been collecting the deferred problems of 2 years. And behind a crate of tools that hadn't been moved in a long time, she found a wooden box. Not decorative. Plain, with a fitted lid. She opened it without ceremony and found inside it the kinds of things you kept in a box. A woman's comb, a spool of thread that had been used down to almost nothing, a child's drawing on a piece of brown paper, a small book. She picked up the book. It was a household ledger, the kind you kept accounts in. The handwriting inside was not Nathaniel's. She knew his handwriting well enough by now to recognize it in the dark. This was someone else's. Neat, small, very even. She looked at the first page and found M. Voss, 1878. She held the book for a moment. Then she put it back in the box and put the lid on and set it on the shelf where it was clearly meant to be. Not because it wasn't her business, but because it was not hers to carry. It belonged to the children, and to Nathaniel, and to the version of this house that had existed before she got here. She could hold space for it without holding it herself. She closed the storage door and went back to the kitchen. Lillian was at the table doing arithmetic for the ledger they'd started keeping together, a real one, with columns, because Evelyn had introduced this in the second month, and Lillian had taken to it with the enthusiasm of someone who had always wanted to impose order on something and finally had a legitimate method. "There's a box in the back storage," Evelyn said. "Wooden, plain lid. Do you know it?" Lillian looked up. Something shifted in her face. "Mama's things," she said. "Papa put them back there after." She paused. "Is it still there?" "Still there." Evelyn sat down across from her. "I thought you should know where it is, in case you wanted it somewhere else." Lillian was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ledger in front of her, at the columns of numbers she'd been working through. "I know what's in it," she said. "The comb and the sewing things. The picture Samuel drew when he was 4. She paused. "The book." "Yes." "She used to let me look at the ledger sometimes. She said keeping good accounts was the same as telling the truth. You couldn't hide from the numbers." Lillian looked at the ledger she was working on. "Is that why you started this?" Evelyn looked at her. "I started it because I can't keep track of things in my head past a certain point," she said. "But your mother's reasoning is better." Something moved across Lillian's face. Not grief, exactly. She'd had 2 years with the grief and it had changed shape, but the particular expression of someone touching something they couldn't hold for long. "Can we keep it in the kitchen?" she asked. "The box, not on display, just somewhere that's not the back storage." "Of course," Evelyn said. Lillian nodded and went back to her numbers. Evelyn went back to hers. They worked side by side in the morning quiet with the kitchen warm around them, and outside the window the ranch was moving into its day. Samuel crossing the yard toward the barn, Rosie crouched beside her tomato plant in the way she did every morning, checking on it with the dedication of a small scientist. And the house was doing the thing houses do when they've been through the worst of something and come out the other side. It was just being a house. Ordinary. Inhabited. Generating the small sounds and movements of people living in it rather than surviving it. That was not nothing. That was in fact the whole thing. That evening, Nathaniel brought the box in from the back storage and set it on the shelf in the main room without ceremony or explanation, and nobody commented on it. And Rosie touched it once as she walked past on the way to bed, the same 2-finger touch she'd used on Evelyn's sleeve that first week, checking if something was real. And then she went upstairs and the house settled into its evening, and the box sat on the shelf where it belonged, present, accounted for, part of the whole. Autumn came to the Voss Ranch the way it always did in that part of Texas. Not gradually, but in a single turn, one morning when you woke up, and the air had changed overnight, and something in the light was different, and you knew without being told that the season had made up its mind. Evelyn noticed it on a Monday. She was in the garden before breakfast, the way she always was, and the air against her face had that particular edge to it, not cold yet, but honest about what was coming. And she stood there for a moment looking at what the garden had become over the course of a summer, and felt something she'd been feeling more often lately without always being able to name it. Satisfaction was part of it, but it was bigger than satisfaction, and quieter. The squash had given well through August and into September. The beans had come in 3 times. The tomatoes that Rosie had tended with her 2-finger devotion had produced more fruit than any of them had expected from a volunteer plant, and they'd put up jars of them, Evelyn and Lillian working together in the hot kitchen on a Thursday in late August. The jars lined up on the counter, Lillian's handwriting on each label because she had the better hand and took the job seriously. Rosie had insisted on labeling the jar from her plant herself. The label said Rosie's tomatoes with no apostrophe and 1 misspelled word, and it was on the shelf in the pantry where it would stay. Samuel had grown 2 inches since spring. Evelyn noticed this the way you notice things about children you saw every day. Not gradually, but suddenly, one afternoon when he came in from the barn, and she realized he was nearly at her shoulder, and she said, "You're getting tall." And he said, "I know." with the particular discomfort of a boy who was aware his body was making decisions without consulting him, and she didn't pursue it because some things were better left as single observations. He was talking more, not constantly. He was still his father's son in that particular way, still a person who chose his words and didn't spend them carelessly. But he'd started telling her things. Small things at first. What he'd seen in the north pasture, what the east cow had been doing. A bird he'd identified using a field guide that had been on the shelf in the main room for years without anyone opening it. Then larger things. He told her on a rainy evening when the two of them were the only ones in the kitchen that he remembered the last thing his mother had said to him. He said it flat, the way he said important things. Evelyn had listened and not moved and not rushed to fill the space after. And eventually he'd said, "She told me to be kind to Rosie. She said Rosie was going to have a harder time than me because she was going to be too little to remember properly." He'd looked at the table. "I didn't always do a good job of that." "You've been doing better," Evelyn said. "I know." He picked up his cup. "I'm trying." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The extension on the back of the house was finished by mid-October. Nathaniel had worked on it in pieces through the summer, the floor first, then the south wall, then the framing for the other three sides, then the roof, when the weather held long enough to let him. He didn't hire help for most of it. Cecil Pruitt came out 2 Saturdays to assist with the roof beams, which were too heavy for one man to set safely, and Evelyn held boards and handed tools and mixed the lime wash for the interior walls, and Samuel worked beside his father with a concentration that Nathaniel watched out of the corner of his eye and didn't comment on, because commenting on it would have made Samuel self-conscious, and the thing happening between them was better without an audience. The room that resulted was not large. It was not intended to be. It ran along the back of the house with 2 windows looking south over the fields, and it had shelves along one wall that Nathaniel had built himself with uneven spacing because he was better at structures than at finish work, and Evelyn had straightened her reaction to the uneven shelves before it became visible on her face, and decided that uneven shelves made by the person you loved were better than perfect shelves made by someone else. She put books on the shelves. The ones she'd brought with her from Abilene, the 2 she'd acquired since, a volume of natural history that had belonged to Samuel and that he'd donated to the room with the magnanimity of a boy who knew he could always take it back. Margaret's household ledger from 1878 was on the shelf too, at Lillian's suggestion, which Evelyn had accepted. It belonged in a room, on a shelf, in the light, not in a box in the back storage. The room became the place where things happened that needed somewhere to happen. Lillian did her accounts there in the evenings. Samuel read the natural history book and several others that Evelyn had found at the back of the general store, where Ada Pruitt had been keeping a box of donated volumes for years without anyone coming to claim them. Rosie drew pictures at the small table by the south window and described them to anyone who would listen, and sometimes Nathaniel would sit in there in the evening and just be still for a while, which was something he was getting better at, allowing himself to occupy a space without needing to be productive in it. The ceremony was small. They discussed what they wanted, which had taken about 10 minutes because they both arrived at the same place from different directions. Something real, not something performed. The county judge came out to the ranch on a Saturday in early November. A man named Beauchamp, who had the manner of someone who had presided over enough human occasions to have stopped being impressed by any of them, which was somehow exactly right. Garrett had made the trip from 40 miles east, which surprised Nathaniel and which he absorbed without comment, but Evelyn saw what it did to him when his brother's wagon came into the yard. Cecil and Ada Pruitt were there. 2 neighboring families whose names Evelyn had learned slowly over the months. The children stood in a row, Lillian in a dress she'd pressed herself with the iron heated 3 times to get it right. Samuel in clothes that almost fit him now that he'd grown. Rosie in her best dress with her hair done by Lillian in a style that was more ambitious than accurate and was perfect because of it. Evelyn wore the blue dress she'd brought in her suitcase on the train from Abilene. She'd mended the hem twice since then and let out the waist once because the ranch work had changed her, and it was the right dress for this occasion, not because it was special, but because it was hers, the dress she'd stepped off the train in when she came here not knowing what she was walking into. Nathaniel wore his good jacket and a clean shirt and had made an attempt at his hair that was partially successful. Judge Beauchamp said the words. Nathaniel said his with the steadiness of a man who had made up his mind thoroughly and was not afraid of it. Evelyn said hers, looking at him directly, because she had spent enough of her life looking at the floor during important moments, and she was done with that. When it was finished, Rosie announced that she was hungry, which broke the moment in exactly the right way. And Ada Pruitt, who had brought more food than anyone had suggested she bring, produced it from the back of her wagon with the satisfaction of a woman who had planned for this exact contingency. They ate outside because the November day was clear and cold enough to make people stand close together, which was its own kind of warmth. Garrett talked to his brother for a long time, in the way of two men who had been avoiding something and had decided to stop. Evelyn watched them from across the yard and thought about what Garrett had said at the well. When someone puts distance between you, sometimes the right thing is to close it anyway. And thought about all the distances she'd crossed in the last several months, and all the ones that still existed in various shapes, and decided that the existence of remaining distances was not a failure. It was just the ongoing nature of being alive with other people. Samuel came and stood beside her. He was eating a piece of cake with the focused attention he brought to food he liked, and he stood next to her and looked at the yard full of people, and after a while said, "Is this what it's supposed to look like?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Family stuff, occasions." He gestured vaguely at the gathering. "It's louder than I expected." "It gets louder," she said, "with more people." He considered this. "Garrett's all right," he said. "I think so too." "He told me about the ranch, the one they grew up on." He glanced at her sideways. "Did you know Papa used to ride before he could walk properly? He just got on the horse before his legs were long enough and wouldn't get off." She looked across the yard at Nathaniel, who was talking to his brother with his arms crossed and the slight forward lean that meant he was actually engaged in what was being said. "No," she said. "I didn't know that." "Garrett says he was impossible when he was young." Samuel almost smiled. "He says he's improved." "He has," she said. Samuel finished his cake. "I'm glad you came back from Missouri," he said. He said it the way he said things that mattered, flatly, without setup, so that by the time you realized what he'd said, he was already walking away. She watched him go. She thought, this is the part nobody tells you about. Not the hard part. Everyone tells you about the hard part. They tell you about the grief and the distance and the doors that won't open and the silences that go on too long. What they don't tell you is that the moment it turns is not dramatic. It's a boy finishing his cake and saying something real in 3 words and then walking away because he's 9, and the cake was good, and there are other things happening. The turning is always quiet. The year ended and a new one began. The ranch moved through its seasons, and Evelyn moved through them with it, and the rhythm of the place became her rhythm in the way that a place does when you stop visiting it and start living in it. He learned which fence sections would need attention in the spring before winter had fully announced itself. She learned the particular sound the East Cow made when something was off with her, which was different from the sound she made when she was simply unhappy about the morning. She learned that Nathaniel was useless before his first cup of coffee, and that this was actually a quality she'd come to find reliable rather than irritating, because a person who was useless before coffee was a person who would tell you exactly how he was feeling before he'd had time to curate it. She learned Lillian, not the managed version, the one who folded things with unnecessary precision and kept her expressions neutral until she'd had time to decide what they meant. She learned the actual Lillian, the girl who stayed up past when she should to finish a book she'd started, who kept a small collection of interesting stones in a tin under her bed and couldn't fully explain why, who occasionally said something so funny and dry that it took you a second to catch it, and then it stayed with you all day. Lillian was 12 now, and the 12-year-old was more complicated than the 11-year-old had been, which was appropriate. And Evelyn navigated the complications the way she navigated most things, by paying attention and not requiring the complications to resolve faster than they were ready to. One evening in February, Lillian came to find her in the back room. Evelyn was mending something. There was always something to mend. She'd made peace with this. And Lillian stood in the doorway for a moment doing the thing she did when she wanted to say something and was deciding how. "Can I ask you something?" Lillian said. "Yes." She came in and sat down across from her. She had something in her hands, a piece of paper, folded. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and then looked at Evelyn. "Mama wrote me a letter," she said, "before she died. I didn't know about it until Papa found it in his things this winter. He said she'd told him to give it to me when I was older and he'd been trying to decide when older was. She paused. He gave it to me last week. Have you read it? Evelyn asked. 3 times. She looked at the folded paper. She says some things about me, about who she thought I'd be. Her jaw was tight. She was holding something together by the same method she always used, the application of will. She says she knew I'd try to be the one who held everything. She says she was the same way. She exhaled. She says the problem with being the one who holds everything is that you forget to let anyone hold you. Evelyn set down her mending. She was right, Lillian said. It came out unsteady. She's always been right about everything, and she's not even here to know it. She didn't cry, exactly. She didn't have the kind of crying that came with sound. She had the other kind, the kind that just meant her face changed and her eyes went bright, and she sat with it without moving. Evelyn did not move toward her immediately. She'd learned this about Lillian. The approach had to be slow, or the thing closed. She waited. After a moment, Lillian looked up. I let you hold me, I think, she said. Sometimes. When I let myself. You do, Evelyn said. More than you think. Lillian folded the letter again carefully and held it in her lap. She would have liked you, she said. She wrote that she said she hoped that if someone came, they'd be someone real. Not someone who was pretending to want us. She met Evelyn's eyes. You're real. Evelyn held her gaze. So are you, she said. Lillian nodded once, the way she nodded when she'd finished processing something and was filing it. She stood up and went to the door and then stopped. I'm going to call you. She paused. She was choosing something carefully. I'm not going to call you Mama. She's Mama. A beat. But I'm going to stop calling you Miss Evelyn. What will you call me? Lillian looked at her with the steady gray eyes that didn't miss anything. Evelyn, she said. Just Evelyn. Like you're mine. She left before Evelyn could answer, which was probably the right choice because Evelyn sat in the back room for a few minutes after that, not mending anything, just sitting, with the February dark outside the south window and the shelves around her full of books and a household ledger from 1878 and everything that had accumulated in this room over the months of people living in it. Just Evelyn, like you're mine. She thought about this woman who had boarded a train in Abilene with 43 cents and a suitcase and a letter that had already been reconsidered. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself. That she was useful but not wanted, capable but not chosen, the person who kept things running for other people without any particular claim on the running herself. She'd carried that belief for so long it had become something like a fact, a given, the ground she stood on. It had been wrong, not because someone had convinced her otherwise, because she'd gone to a place where she was needed and stayed when staying was hard and fought for things that weren't hers yet until they became hers. And that process, that particular slow earning of a place, had been the thing that changed the ground. You couldn't be told you were wanted. You had to do the thing and let the wanting be the result of it. Spring returned. The garden was bigger that year. She'd expanded it over the winter, planning it on paper with Lillian during the cold evenings, working out what had done well and what needed different placement and what new things were worth trying. She'd ordered seeds from a catalog, and there was a moment in March when the packets arrived and Rosie had to be physically prevented from opening them all immediately to see what they looked like. They're seeds, Samuel told her. They look like seeds. I want to see what kind. It says on the packet. I want to see. Evelyn gave her one packet, the marigolds, which were not a food crop and could afford to be inspected without consequence. And Rosie sat at the kitchen table and looked at the seeds in her palm with the seriousness of a scientist for a long time before carefully putting them back. They look like something, she said. They look like marigold seeds, Samuel said. No, like something's in them. She put the packet down. Like they already know what they're going to be. Samuel opened his mouth and then closed it, because even at 9, he understood when an argument was not worth having. Evelyn planted the marigolds along the border of the garden, and by June they were blooming in the particular orange and yellow that marigolds insisted on, which was a color that asked nothing of you except to look at it. Rosie checked on them every morning. There were still hard days. There were days when Nathaniel went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with his ordinary quiet, when something caught him sideways, a sound or a season or some small thing that the rest of them didn't see, and he'd go somewhere inside himself for a while. She'd learned not to follow him there immediately. She'd learned to be nearby and available and to wait for him to come back, which he always did. And when he did, she didn't ask what it had been about, because he usually couldn't have said, and that was all right. Grief didn't owe anyone an explanation. It just showed up. There were days when Lillian was 13 going on 45, and the weight of her own seriousness became too much even for her, and she snapped at everyone in the household before going silent for an afternoon. There were days when Samuel's patience ran out in some direction nobody expected. There were days when Rosie was simply 6, then 7, in the complete way of young children, entirely themselves, entirely present, taking up every available inch of space in a house with their noise and their questions and their total confidence that the people around them would hold. They held. Not perfectly. Nobody held perfectly. But consistently and with effort and with the particular understanding that had built up in them over a year of living through things together. The understanding that you didn't have to be fine all the time, you just had to keep showing up. On an evening in the middle of the following summer, Evelyn was in the garden at the end of the day when Nathaniel came and sat down on the low garden wall she'd built that spring. A small thing, just stacked stone, to define the edge of the expanded plot, and watched her work. "The squash are better than last year," he said. "East corner," she said. "You told me that the first week. You remembered." "I always remember practical things?" He was quiet for a moment. The evening light was doing what it always did, that warning and beautiful color, and the ranch was settling into its sounds around them. "I want to tell you something," he said. She kept her hands in the soil. "Tell me." "When Garrett came and brought the letters, Margaret's letters to my father, I read them all in one night." He paused. "There was one I didn't tell you about." She waited. She wrote that she was afraid I'd spend the rest of my life apologizing for surviving her. He said it evenly. She said she'd seen me do that already, while she was still alive, apologizing for being the one who was well when she wasn't, for not knowing how to fix things. He looked at the garden. She said she wanted me to stop apologizing for being the person who was left. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at him. "She was right," she said. "I know." He met her eyes. "I've been trying to." "I know you have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't come here to fix us." "No," she said, "but you did anyway. That's not how I'd put it." He tilted his head slightly. "How would you put it?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "I came here because I needed somewhere to be," she said. "And you needed someone to be here. And the fixing, whatever you want to call it, that wasn't one person doing something to another person. That was all of us doing it. Together." She looked at the garden. "The garden's not mine. I didn't make it. I just showed up for it, every morning, until it became something." He looked at the garden too. "You showed up for us," he said. "You let me," she said. "Eventually." He made the sound she'd come to love, the almost laugh, the one that had been so rare at the beginning and was more available now, the one that meant he'd dropped the guard enough to let something through. "I was slow," he said. "You were scared," she said. "That's different." He reached over and put his hand on hers where it was resting on the garden wall. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. From inside the house, Rosie was calling for someone, not with urgency, just the ordinary call of a child who has decided something needs immediate attention. Samuel's voice came back, patient in the way he'd become patient with her, explaining something at length that she was probably not going to accept. Lillian's voice cut through both of them with the authority she'd been cultivating for years and would probably carry for the rest of her life. Nathaniel looked toward the house. "We should go in," he said. "In a minute," she said. They sat together on the low garden wall in the summer evening with the light going orange and the marigolds still holding their color at the border of the garden and the sounds of the house coming out to them through the warm air. They'd been through a winter and a spring and a summer and were heading toward another fall. And the ranch was a different place than it had been when she'd stepped off a train with 43 cents and a suitcase and a letter that had already been reconsidered. It was not a perfect place. It was full of uneven shelves and fence posts that needed attention and a household ledger from 1878 on a shelf in the back room, and a boy who grew 2 inches when nobody was watching, and a girl who held everything until she learned to let herself be held, and a small girl who watered her marigolds every morning and believed that seeds already knew what they were going to be. It was full of a man who was learning to stop apologizing for being the one who was left. And it was full of a woman who had spent most of her adult life being useful without being wanted, and who had come to understand, slowly, through the work of it, that belonging was not something you were given. You built it, with your hands in the actual soil of an actual place, with actual people who were difficult and grieving and real. You showed up every morning until it became something. And one day, without announcement, without ceremony, you looked around at what had grown, imperfect, uneven, alive, and you understood that you were exactly where you had always been trying to get to. You were home,